The English came to Canada in substantial numbers from the late 18th century and dominated the overall influx of immigrants after Confederation. But few commentators or historians saw fit to write up their story, despite their very large numbers. Their story is plain to see from the documents which they left behind in archives on both sides of the Atlantic. These documents give them a voice, and I hope you will hear their voice today as I quote from their letters and diaries. There is no doubt that their story deserves to be told. Now, the English have partly themselves to blame for seemingly fading into obscurity. When they arrived, they kept any feelings they had about it being English to themselves. Coming as they did from the most powerful nation of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, they felt they had very little need to explain who they were. They did not indulge in flag waving or march in parades. They simply merged into the background and became Canadians. If they did attract attention, it was for the wrong reasons. The British government's policy of offloading its surplus poor from the slums of the great English cities to parts of Canada during the late 19th and early 20th centuries was understandably very unpopular with Canadians, while the grumbling and condescending tendencies of some of the English middle and upper classes also proved to be very annoying. However, while great scorn has been poured on a few malcontents and misfits, most of the English were unassuming stalwarts, and we're about to hear their story. Now, immigration, as always, was driven partly by detrimental economic changes and also by the prospect of better times in Canada. But it was always going to be a gigantic leap of faith. It took great courage, resilience, and an indomitable spirit to become a successful immigrant. Farming was fraught with setbacks, back-breaking toil, and terrible hardships, while in the cities and towns, many English struggled to find jobs, which were often low paid. Nevertheless, this is an enriching story of independently minded and hardworking people who helped to people a nation and along the way enhanced it with their multifaceted skills. Now, immigration from England began slowly and only reached substantial numbers after 1830. A major turning point occurred in the late 19th century when sailing ships gave way to steamships and Canada acquired a transcontinental railway. This paved the way for the mass influx of English which followed. But before we deal with this great exodus of English in the 19th and 20th century, we must, first of all, go back to the early 1770s. This was when 900 immigrants from Yorkshire, the north and east ridings of Yorkshire, first colonized the Chignecto Isthmus, a region of rich marshland which connects Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And in fact, what you're looking at, this little memorial stone archway, believe it or not, is the only memorial to these 900 Yorkshire settlers to be found in the Maritimes. Again, the very low profile of the English. A combination of rent increases in Yorkshire and the desire to benefit from Atlantic Canada's agricultural potential were the main reasons why they left. Some were Methodists who sought a safe haven in which to practice their faith. The Yorkshire settlers effectively doubled the population of the isthmus, and by bringing their more advanced farming techniques, helped to stimulate the economic development of the entire region. The American War of Independence, fought between 1775 and 1783, and the Napoleonic Wars which followed understandably brought a halt to immigration. But when peace returned in 1815, further waves of Yorkshire people followed, with many settling on the opposite side of the Northumberland Strait in Prince Edward Island. By then, the best land in the Chignecto Isthmus had been taken, hence their choice. But, being good Yorkshire people, their sights were far wider than this. They were the first to recognize the timber and farming opportunities in the Richelieu Valley in southwestern Quebec. And unlike all of the other English, unlike the Scots and unlike the Irish, Yorkshire people had no problem in renting land. They didn't care about whether they owned the land, because of course they were renting land in seigneuries when they went to Lower Canada. They learned of the potential of this area through a Yorkshire landowner who had business dealings there, and a steady stream of farmers and tradesmen piled into the Lacolle seigneury from 1817, turning it into a major Yorkshire enclave. So if you visited that part of Lower Canada then, you would have heard all these lovely Yorkshire accents. Here we have a photograph of the Methodist Church in Henrysburg, which is in the Lacolle area. And of course, Yorkshire-born James Booth was the first Methodist minister to come, and he arrived in 1823. However, I'm just going to have a little sip. However, as the much better land opportunities and climate to be found in Upper Canada became apparent, Lacolle lost its appeal. And of course, the inland routes to Upper Canada opening. Now here is where the English story changes a gear. The scattered pockets of English settlements to be found in the Maritimes and Quebec gave way to enormous English enclaves, which began to form in Upper Canada from 1830. And while people came from the length and breadth of England, a striking proportion originated from 3 counties. Those 3 counties are Yorkshire, Devon, and Cornwall. Now, this map of England will just give you a quick overview of what I've been talking about. There's Yorkshire and Devon and Cornwall over here. A lot of people from this part, from the southern coastal areas, are helped to emigrate because of the change in farming conditions, so heavy immigration from these areas, and Norfolk and Suffolk, which is another farming county. And here you have England's industrial heartland, and later on they leave, but as I will explain as I go along, these people don't become farmers in Canada. They look for jobs in towns and cities in Canada. So where did they settle? I'm going to give you a very quick overview. We'll go very quickly through these because obviously we haven't got time to spend on any one thing. But I wanted to just acquaint you with the 3 parts of Upper Canada where you will find heavy concentrations of English. Here north of Lake Ontario, you had the early Loyalist settlers coming along here, very large concentrations of Yorkshire people in this area, and also Devon people. Now, moving on to the area, to the Lake Erie region, we have the Talbot settlements here, which attracted many people from Wiltshire and Somerset. I'm just going very quickly. You can see these pockets. They're talking about hundreds, in some cases thousands of English settling in these particular counties. And then here in the Huron tract, you've got a remarkable story. If I look at this area, it's a vast area covering 2 counties and many townships. And this is almost entirely Devon people, all of them good Bible Christians. I learned a great deal about them by getting hold of the documents of the Bible Christians. But it is amazing how they just decided, they just almost like Scottish Highlanders did. They took over this stretch of the Huron tract, and that was basically Little Devon. Now, finally, not going to spend too much time on Northern Ontario, but Northern Ontario attracted considerable English. And if you look at the census returns, you'll be amazed at the high concentrations of English in districts like Algoma and in Cochrane. But I wanted to point out the mines, the Bruce mines, the Coppercliff and the Victoria mines near Sault Ste. Marie. This is large numbers of Cornishmen and their families settled here. The Cornishmen would go to any mine at all. These were silver and copper mines. They didn't care what mines they were. They traveled the world to mine. And the way it worked in Northern Ontario was you mined in the winter and you farmed in the summer. Now, so far, a very quick overview. The people who I described as ending up in those places normally paid their own travel costs. But one of the things that made the English different was that a very, very high proportion of their agricultural laborers who were thrown out of work by the invention of combine harvesters were assisted to emigrate, the so-called paupers. And they came from Wiltshire, Somerset, Kent, Sussex, Norfolk, and Suffolk in very, very, very large numbers, several thousands in some years. And the voice I want you to hear now is of one of these labourers who came from somewhere in Wiltshire. He'd been a Wiltshire tradesman. His name is Philip Annett. And he put pen to paper soon after arriving. And I think this will tell you more than I can in many, many words. I think you was better sell your house and come to Upper Canada while you have a chance. If you don't come soon, it is likely you will starve. And if you don't, your children will. I was agreeably surprised when I came here to see what a fine country it was. It being excellent land bearing crops of wheat and other corn for 20 to 30 years without any dung. You have no rent to pay, no poor rates, and scarcely any taxes. No gamekeepers or lords over you, and that was important. I think no Englishman can do better than come as soon as possible, if it costs them every farthing they have. For I would rather be so here than in England with £100 in my pocket. Well, letters like that back home, of course, caused a deluge of people to join people like Philip Annett. And it wasn't just Upper Canada who got these very poor farm labourers. They also, the Norfolk and Suffolk ones, went to the British American Land Company acreages in the eastern townships in Lower Canada. Here, the attraction was good land, plentiful jobs, and the brief example, if you like, of their settlement at Bury is the St. John Anglican Church. I mean, you'd be amazed if you drove around this part of the eastern townships today to think it was once full of people from Norfolk and Suffolk. You would be amazed. And it's just the odd little church that is a reminder that they had been and gone, because of course they didn't stay. The French culture didn't suit them, and they all left for Upper Canada eventually. So now we are stepping up a big gear. We're now in top gear as far as the story is concerned, because I'm taking you forward to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. English emigration suddenly rocketed, and settlement patterns once again changed. Sometimes as many as 100,000 English people arrived in a single year. It's staggering, isn't it? Canada was now the preferred destination. In the past, the United States had been the preferred destination. In that map of England I showed you, and I showed you the industrial heartland, well, everyone living in the north of England, in the Midlands, was going to the States because they could get good jobs there. But after Confederation, Canada's economy improved rapidly, and so people could see the job prospects to be had. But an equally important attraction was the pull of empire, British Empire feelings and patriotic feelings towards the Queen or King, towards the monarchy, were so high that this was a considerable lure for people from England. They wanted to be in one of the British dominions. The final part of the story, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was the arrival of steamships and the building of the transcontinental railway across Canada, which was completed in 1895. With those developments, travel was quicker and easier, and at the same time, the Canadian government and the Canadian Pacific Railway, which had built the railway, ran enthusiastic promotional campaigns focusing attention on the agricultural potential of the Canadian West. And I love this visual. I can just imagine these horse-drawn wagons going around some of the little towns and villages where I live in Wiltshire, and people gathering around to look at the leaflets and hear what the immigration agent had to say. You see, the thing was that it was quite easy to attract people, because the government was offering, through the Dominion Lands Act of 1872, it was offering 160 acres of free land. All you had to do was pay a registration fee of $10 and abide by the procedures for settlement. You had to clear so many acres in so many years. Okay, so there was this hoop-de-doo about the Canadian West. It was the intention of the Canadian government to get as many English to the West, to develop it, and they weren't terribly interested in having them go to Ontario and Quebec. But as you will hear later, their plan didn't quite work as they intended. Now, the movement of English people to the prairies has to be seen as having had two phases. Phase one was when the Ontario, Quebec, and maritime people heard of all this publicity, heard about the wonderful land opportunities in the prairies, and said, "We're going." And they came in the 1870s in carts, 10 years before the railways were built. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Having all your possessions and sometimes your cattle trailing along behind you and pushing along in a cart. They basically followed the old fur trade tracks and made their way, as best they could, to the West. The reason why there was this huge turnout from mid-Canada and eastern Canada was they had heard that the prairies was a place where there were no trees to chop and there were no stumps to remove, and that was an incredible inducement. However, the transition to prairie life proved to be very daunting. It wasn't as easy as they thought. The ones who came from Canada already, who understood about Canadian farming, found it a dead dawdle. But the ones who arrived directly from England had a shock. And I'll give you an example here of an upper-class lady's immediate reaction when she went to visit her brother in a farm in Manitoba in 1882. She says, "It is very certain that no gentleman ought to come out to this country, or when here can expect to prosper, unless he has some capital, heaps of energy and brains, or is quite prepared to work as a common laborer. The latter command the most wonderful wages. There is such a demand for them that one can hardly pick and choose. It is surprising to me that the whole of the poorer classes of England and Ireland, hearing of these wages, do not emigrate, particularly when nowadays the steerage in the passenger ships seems to be so comfortable, and that for about £6 they can be landed on this side of the Atlantic." And it's clear in her letter, she says that she herself discarded her lady's ways. She threw herself into jobs that she would never have dreamt of doing back home. She helped with haymaking, painting the barn roof, and she drove posts into the ground for the new fences, quote, "with a fearfully heavy mallet which I could hardly lift," unquote. And of course, her brother did the same. Back in England, they would have had any number of laborers who would have been paid a pittance. But in Manitoba, where wages were high and labor was scarce, they both, she had to, as she put it, sink the lady, and he had to sink the gentleman. And that came as a bit of a shock to many well-off English people. Now, that is a map of 1911, based on the census for that year, and it is meant to show the concentrations of English, as you can see, in the southwest part of the province. In every example I'm giving you of the prairies, the 3 prairie provinces in BC, it will sound repetitive. The English were the largest ethnic group in 1911. And the other thing that will sound repetitive is that if you look at all these towns like Winnipeg, or no, cities I should say, Winnipeg, Portage-la-Prairie, and Brandon, the English dominated those cities. If you look at all those towns that are scattered around, the English dominated the towns. And I'll make this point here, that one of the things to remember if you're hunting ancestors who left from England is don't be too sure about the fact that they came and farmed. Because with the increasing amount of mechanization in Britain, people were having difficulty finding work, people who had been farmers and dairymen and so forth. And they found themselves finding some sort of work in the towns and cities in England. And they thought to themselves, well, this beats digging up and planting turnips, thank you very much. It's an easier life than having to go out into a field all day and dig and plow and what have you. They discovered that they quite liked being townies. They liked being urban dwellers. The English were really the first of the urban dwellers in Britain. They were the ones who actually grabbed that with both hands. So having discovered they liked being townies and living in cities, they opted for whatever employment they could find in prairie towns and cities, much to the annoyance of the Canadian immigration officials who wanted them to help with the harvest. They didn't want them working in the towns and cities. And it also annoyed the Canadian trade unions who thought the English were taking jobs away from Canadians. So the English had a mind of their own, and they weren't going to be told by anybody. Look for them in the towns and cities. Meanwhile, Victorian England was changing. Inspired by their queen, large families of 10 and 12 children were common in England. Now, that was far too many for a business, be it farming or manufacturing, to support. And so the idea started to develop that will send some of the sons off to Canada to make their fortunes. Also, the prairies were seen as a wonderful place to go if you were rich and fallen on hard times. An example I'll give you is Captain Edward Mitchell Pearce, a Somerset wine merchant and landowner who founded an English colony south of Moosomin. Forgive my pronunciation, is it Moosomin or Moosomin, but I think it's Moosomin. He founded the Cannington Manor, which is number 6 there. He founded that manor, which he called Cannington Manor, that settlement, as an English settlement in the hope that it would restore his fortune. Now, while we're looking at this map, I'm going to come back to Mr. Pearce in a minute, but I just wanted you to see the overall story for the English in Saskatchewan. If we look at the bottom, you can see again the concentration mainly in the south, except, and I'll be coming to this, this is the famous Bar Colony, which later got called Battleford. We'll park that on one side. But we have Moose Jaw, Regina, and Qu'Appelle, with the largest concentrations of English, and major numbers in Moose Jaw, Regina, and Saskatoon, and not Prince Albert in this case, but in Saskatoon. And I thought, did you know, I don't know if you know this, but Saskatoon was founded in 1882 by the Temperance Colonization Society, which was run by Methodists in Toronto. Apparently 100 settlers founded it. I don't think it remained teetotal for very long, but that was the teetotal capital of Saskatchewan for a while. Now, that's Captain Edward Pearce, fine-looking man, kind-looking gentleman. Well, he named his place in Saskatchewan, Cannington Manor, after Somerset Parish, which had the name Cannington. He arrived with his wife and children in 1882 to build his community. But it failed, as so many of these failed, because men like Captain Pearce, who were a bit la-di-da and didn't really understand how Canada worked, had poor judgment. He recruited men from genteel English families who didn't have a clue about hard work, and many of them didn't know anything about farming, so it wasn't very sensible. Now, the really famous colony, which got off to a very bad start, but which survived, and on the previous slide I showed you Battleford, the Bar Colony. Well, the Bar Colony was that. It was established in 1903 on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border, and is yet another example of a foolishly planned emigration scheme which nearly ended in disaster. It was the brainchild of the Reverend Isaac Barr. Now, believe it or not, and I'm not making this up, this is true, he had an imperialistic plan of founding an all-British agricultural colony. That's fine, you say, there's nothing wrong with that. But guess where he recruited these people from? He recruited them from the towns and cities of England. So you had bricklayers and carpenters and engine drivers and plate makers and everything under the sun, but you didn't have farmers. So it was deplorable. And not only that, he didn't do the planning. He ordered a ship which was far too small for the number of people, and he didn't do the onward travel plans very sensibly. There was great suffering and great hardship, and in the end, the 2,000 of them, in fact, 2,000 of them came in this one group in 1903. They rebelled. Now, here is a photograph of them, you know, letting off steam in their tents near the immigration hall at Saskatoon. This was all hurriedly arranged for them because they arrived at Saskatoon by train, and nothing had been arranged, and it was an absolute mess. And in the end, they made their way to the future Bar Colony in carts along tracks. But this is a story with a very, very happy ending. Barr was ousted as leader, and the colony's chaplain, the Reverend George Lloyd, hence Lloydminster, which was one of the names given to the area, was elected in his place. The settlers immediately sought people in the area who could teach them how to farm, irrespective of whether they were British. This display of common sense ensured the survival of the colony, which went on to become the largest and most successful of the English settlements in the prairies. Now, having said that, this is a very well-documented story, the Barr Colony. No problem about who they were and how they came, etc. But as you all know as genealogists, the majority of people don't leave papers behind. Very, very difficult to find out where they came from, where they were going, and how they got on. And I'll give you an example of a letter that I found in a county record office in England. It's just a typical, this is how it worked. The majority of English people actually came on their own or in small family groups. I'm going to give you the example of Mr. J.R. Appleby, who was a coal miner from Newcastle upon Tyne, and he made the leap from being an industrial worker to being a homesteader in one bound. He was a very brave person to try and do that. He arrived in Winnipeg in 1903 with his son and a friend, and they spent their first night sleeping on, quote, a big table, not a bed, a big table in the immigration hall. So things were pretty basic. The following day, they were met by a friend who, quote, drove us 5 miles to his place at Estevan, where he and his good wife sheltered and cared for us with great kindness until we got fixed up with our own place. However, Appleby still needed help, and quoting from his letter again, he said, "Not one of us could put the harness on a horse or even take it off when it was put on for us." That's how green he was. Yet again, his friend came to the rescue and enabled him to become a successful homesteader, being joined later by his eldest son, who acquired the land next to his. Well, as it was the case with Manitoba, the English were the dominant ethnic group in Saskatchewan, with most being concentrated in and near Regina, Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, and Battleford, brackets Bar Colony. Now we turn to Alberta. And did you know that the majority of the first cattle ranches in Alberta were founded by English farmers? I was surprised by that, but they were. The reason why is that you needed wealth, you needed capital to buy big herds, and that's why the English dominated in this particular enterprise. The younger sons of wealthy English families spotted Alberta's potential for cattle ranching and packed their sons off with bags of money to invest. The colonization of the Alberta ranch lands, spreading east from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, represents one of the most iconic periods of Canada's pioneering history. Ranchers, Wild West cowboys, and fortunes won and lost excite the imagination. But in truth, the tale was much more a case of hard work, good luck, and especially an iron will to succeed, because there were so many things that went wrong, frosts, crop failure, etc. Ranching was initially concentrated in the Fort Macleod district, but with the arrival of the CPR in 1883, it became increasingly concentrated further north around Calgary. Upper and middle class Englishmen with a pluckiness and money dominated its early development. Now we have the 1911 census summary, again showing you concentrations of English in these two census districts in Calgary and Macleod, the great ranching areas. I might just mention, because we're talking about specifically the English here, that Lethbridge here and Drumheller were major coal mining areas, and they attracted lots and lots of people from Lancashire in the north of England. That's a separate story. But mainly, the English were attracted by these ranch lands. Now, a typical example of a well-heeled would-be rancher was Claude Gardner. Arriving at Fort Macleod in 1894 at the age of 23, he worked as a ranch hand, earning £2 per month plus room and board. Quoting him in his letter home, he says, "This was a generous allowance for a green Englishman, particularly during the winter months, when many men were glad to exchange their labours for nothing more than an assurance of food and lodgings," unquote. But things changed for him, because in the following year, his grandfather wrote to him saying that he would give Claude £1,000 to establish his own ranch. Well, Claude was over the moon. He rented a room in the Temperance Hotel, the local Temperance Hotel, near where he was staying in Red Deer. And he wrote in his letter, "You bet I slept last night. I have not slept in such a bed for a long time. I was glad to leave my employer's house. It was small and full of children, and wait for this, and I had to sleep on the kitchen floor." And this is interesting. This is an upper-class English gentleman who was happy to sleep on the kitchen floor all this time and happy to earn a tiny wage because he could see that money would come from home if he showed sign that he was going to be able to stick it and make something of himself. But it was tough for young men. It really was tough. Meanwhile, the Canadian government's campaigning efforts in the 1890s promoting British Columbia's many advantages attracted large numbers of English immigrants who mainly gravitated once again to the towns and cities in the southwest of the province. Now let me show you a map of British Columbia. You can see the north-south valleys, the famous Okanawan Valley, the Fruit Valley. You can see the Kootenay Valley, the Windermere. These are all great fruit farming areas. And you had the gold mines in this area. You had the railway lines going through some of the industrial areas. But the thing about British Columbia which stands out is that it is incredibly English. British Columbia attracted very few European immigrants, unlike the prairies, which of course attracted people from Ukraine, Russia, Iceland, etc., etc. British Columbia was very, very, very British. Now, needless to say, British Columbia's gold and coal deposits brought many English miners to its industrial regions, while the fruit farming potential of the Okanawan Valley attracted large numbers of genteel English. Most were families of retired professionals, businessmen, and military officers who came not only to make their fortune, but to enjoy the limitless opportunities for hunting, shooting, and fishing in a congenial environment. They formed a distinct social set, and they really did think themselves as being superior to mere colonials. And as you can imagine, that did not go down very well with our fellow Canadians. But they stayed like that, and that particular generation died out behaving like that, but their children became what you might call acclimatized. I was amused by this. As late as 1926, a British man visited the Okanawan Valley, and he said he met English people, quote, who cannot remember that they are not still in England, who never fail to apologize for the climate, or for the fact that the silver hasn't been polished, the lack of servants, and end by asking you to tea next Thursday. Oh, that's the way it was. Well, I'm going to give you a summary of all the places, of all the prairie provinces in BC in a couple of sentences now, because there's a key point that has to be made. All the way through, I was mentioning the large English presence in each of those provinces. But don't be fooled by it. The large English presence in the prairies was primarily due to people with English ancestry who moved from other parts of Canada, who from mid and eastern Canada. The English-born, that is, the people who emigrated directly from England, split their numbers more or less 50-50 between Ontario and the prairies. And it should be remembered that because they did this, this is a staggering statistic. By 1921, Ontario had acquired nearly half of Canada's English population. Now, you might say, well, why did they not go to the prairies? Why were they not swept along by all that propaganda about the tremendous advantages of the prairies? Well, the reason is that as the prairies were being developed, and you had this new agricultural development taking place in Canada, this greatly expanded the manufacturing and industrial base in Quebec and Ontario. And being lovers of towns and cities, and having discovered the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the English were drawn to these opportunities in mid-Canada. So that is, again, if you're ancestor hunting, that's an important thing to remember. Now, I'm going to, in my final section, I'm going to deal with the rather sensitive subject of how they were regarded. As you can tell from what I've said so far, they had one or two problems in the way they presented themselves. Not everybody loved them. Now, it has to be said that, annoyingly for Canadians, some middle and upper class English came with condescending attitudes towards Canadians and their culture. And I can't think of a better example to give you of these condescending attitudes than this quote I'm about to give you. It is a letter written by an Ontario-born lady. Her name is Mary Inderwick. She married an Englishman of high social status who came to Alberta to become a rancher. And his elite friends would come to visit. And this would annoy, they would annoy her by how they spoke to her. The crowning insult to me is the cool way in which they say, "But we do not look on you as Canadian," and they mistake this for a compliment. It makes my Canadian blood boil. I answer that, though I have married an Englishman, I have not lost my identity, and I'm purely Canadian and proud of it. They simply do not understand that I really mean it. They thought they were paying her a compliment by saying, "We regard you as British, or we regard you as English, not as a nasty Canadian." Would you believe it? That is how they spoke to Canadians. Now, the other thing, which I've already touched on, which annoyed Canadians, was the way in which they had to receive all these unwashed paupers, you know, the very, very poorest of the poor from the slums, many arriving from towns and cities with no interest in farming, many of them actually being virtually unemployable because they'd been living in workhouses for so long, they really lost the will to work. This gave Canada a tremendous problem. I mean, the British government didn't mean to be awkward. The civil servants took the view, Canada needs people, we've got too many people, surely we can come to some arrangement here. But the problem was that the people that Canada needed were people who could farm and wanted to farm, and the poor people that Britain was sending were people who didn't know the first thing about farming and didn't want to learn, which made things worse. Now, this policy of getting rid of unwanted people, as you know, also led to the shipment of large numbers of orphaned and abandoned children to Canada, the so-called home children, which so much have been so studied and which everyone is rightly concerned about. Now, I'm not going to talk about home children in general. I'm going to talk about this one example because I think it sums up what was happening in Britain at the time. These 52 boys, who you can see standing on the steps of the Manchester Town Hall in coats that are far too big for them, they're very sad-looking little boys. They had lived in the Manchester and Salford refuges, orphanages, and workhouses. The good mayor is there. There's a few of the officials around at the back, and good ladies seeing them off, making sure everything was done properly. And speeches were made on the steps of the Manchester Town Hall to great aplomb. And Thomas Ackroyd, who'd actually organized this group, in his speech, said this: "The committee quite recognized the importance of keeping healthy and honest children at home in Manchester and preparing them for work in our country. But these were boys and girls who need to be rescued every year from degrading and dangerous surroundings, and it was only this class that they emigrated." In other words, Canada was getting the unwanted children, but thank you very much, Manchester was keeping all the good, healthy ones. Well, that attitude is not a terribly friendly or good attitude as far as Canada was concerned. But what really shocked me, in the same this stuff comes from the Manchester Archive, and it's a wonderful archive. It's full of material of this nature. I came across a press cutting which shocked me, and it was referring to the remarks of a Birmingham magistrate. He was in a bit of a temper because he was suggesting that one of the criminals who had appeared before his court should be sent to Canada. This man was named Pettit, and he'd been charged with drunkenness and attempted murder. And the Birmingham magistrate actually sent this grumpy letter to the papers complaining about the Canadian immigration minister's decision not to allow him in. And I'm just quoting from some of it. It's quite amazing, isn't it? Canada requires more population. If he, the magistrate, could induce 300 such persons, i.e. 300 convicted criminals, to take up residence in Canada, the Dominion, in his view, would greatly benefit by them. So you had this kind of thinking in Britain going on. So it's little wonder that some of the English got up people's noses when they arrived, isn't it? Such a gap in understanding of what Canada's needs were, and even respect for Canada's needs. England's long history of military conquest and prosperity left its people with a strong sense of self-belief, which sometimes came across as arrogance. However, the occasional grumblers should not be allowed to dominate the story. The unassuming miners, carpenters, tailors, laborers, domestic servants, farmers, weavers, shoemakers, and other workers were all part of the invisible immigrant stream which furnished Canada with a large part of its population. People like Thomas Douglas and his wife. Oh, sorry, I meant to read that out, but sorry about that. People like Thomas Douglas and his wife from Newcastle upon Tyne were typical of the many thousands of English who sought a new life in Canada. Now, I realize that that's almost a distressing photograph, isn't it? The burden of pioneering. Poor Thomas. He's had more than he could take. And he had his wonderful missus by his side here. But that picture has to be seen, and that picture has to be remembered, because too much emphasis has been put by previous commentators and writers on the dandies, on the flashy, wealthy kids who came and annoyed everybody. The majority of people were hard-working people like Thomas Douglas and his wife. They were the salt of the earth, and that's how most English people should be regarded. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Douglas, if you'd met them and you'd asked them if they were English, they would have wondered what you meant. Now, this is important for understanding the English. They would have said, well, I suppose we've come from Britain, and they would immediately confuse you, because they'd be making one minute you ask them if they were English, and they'd be telling you they were British, because they saw no difference between being English or British. But they would really respond when you said, now what part of England do you come from? Oh, well, we're Geordies, we're from Newcastle on Tyne. And they would get a long spiel about everything they remembered about Newcastle on Tyne, and the fact that they had made friends with people in their area who came from Newcastle. And this is the key point I want to end on as far as how one sees English identity. And this is really important. Unlike the Scots and Irish, who went for national symbols, bagpipes and tartans and everything, the English never did. But that wasn't because they didn't care about their homeland. If they had patriotic feelings about home, it was about Yorkshire or Devon or Cornwall or Lancashire. They didn't have any sense of being English. Now, this wonderful painting is in London in Tate Britain Art Gallery, and it shows a carpenter from Surrey with his family. The carpenter is saying goodbye to a hillside in Surrey. His As you can see, his wife's not too pleased. She's not at all happy about the fact that they're emigrating, and the children are trying to understand what's going on. Now, they would also tell Canadians they came from Surrey, not England. Their county background was far more important than the generality of being English. They strongly identified with Surrey when they were in England, and they did it in spades when they got to Canada, just like the Scots and Irish went overboard to represent their ethnic identity. These people joined societies which brought together people from Surrey or people from Sussex and so forth. Right. Well, in conclusion, the English actually dominated the overall influx to Canada. In 1921, some 2.5 million Canadians claimed English ancestry, more than the Scots and Irish put together. And that's the real killer point. More than the Scots and Irish put together. They brought their skills and knowledge with them, made a huge contribution to Canada's development, but left few outward signs of their Englishness along the way. They were the silent majority who simply faded into the background. Thank you.
This man from Norfolk would like to thank Lucille for her very insightful presentation. We've got a little time for questions, and we've got some microphones coming around, so please.
I'm from Suffolk.
Oh, right. Hello.
I'm just wondering, you talked about one convict. Were there convict shipments to Canada?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of what you said.
Yeah, were there convict shipments to Canada?
Convicts?
Yes.
Very little. Some convicts to Nova Scotia, but Nova Scotia said, thank you very much, don't send us any more. I mean, it's a different story to, say, Australia. I mean, this is a very interesting question you've asked, because I come from the village of Dinton in Wiltshire, and the lord of the manor in Dinton had big interest in Australia. And he found a very convenient source of cheap labor, like free labor, like slave labor, was to get his father, who was a magistrate in Wiltshire, to transport, to send the convicts in Wiltshire to Australia. And it was a long tradition in Australia, which operated for many years, that if you wanted cheap labor, you used convicts. Now, Canada never, ever went down that route. That is one of the really important differences between Canada and Australia. And one of the things that, if you like, put a lot of well-off English people off in the beginning, because they were used to having, effectively, you know, very cheap labor in England. They were paid nothing. They came to Canada and they just couldn't afford the labor. And if they had a wife who said, I'm sorry, dear, but I'm not getting my hands dirty. I didn't come here with a, you know, pound in fences and dig the ground. They had to go home.
I got family from both Norfolk and Devon.
Yeah.
The Norfolk folks came over in the 1837, 1838. The Devon folks came over in 1842. But they didn't settle in any of the areas you touched on. They settled in Lennox and Addington and Frontenac. Were there any...
Well, yeah, I think that I would look for there is some connection with loyalists. That was a strong loyalist area, wasn't it? I wonder if they had family connections with people who had settled there earlier. Very often that's the reason, that deep buried in your family will be a loyalist family who settled there, and then news got around, and the tradition of going to that part of Upper Canada would have flowed from that. That's a possibility anyway. I mean, it's absolutely right to say that the generalizations don't always work, that people when they emigrated, and it also depends on when you're talking about a small number of people going together or just individuals. I mean, you may have had 2 or 3 different stories running in parallel. You might have had somebody who was looking for a particular type of work in a specialist area or a particular type of farming land. Might have been people who wanting to join relatives. It could be in any one of a number of factors, but all I do when I do my analyses of the data is I first of all work out where the English were concentrated, and then I use other data that I get, like religious data is often very useful, to see if I can define the part of England that they came from. But the first thought I would have is there might be some loyalist interest there.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Yes. I noticed in your presentation you didn't mention anything about the military settlements. And in fact, following the War of 1812, I believe a number of British regiments were demobilized, and many of the people stayed in Canada and formed things like the Richmond settlement just outside of Ottawa.
There were a few in Richmond. The military settlements are not as important for the English as they are obviously for the Scots and Irish, where they were major, like you had the Rideau Valley settlements and the Drummondville settlements in Lower Canada. Yes, I do cover that in my book, the Richmond settlement, yes. But relatively small. Relatively small. You see, until about the Confederation, relatively few English came to Canada. This is one of the things you have to bear in mind, that oddly enough, you would have thought that, pull of empire and everything, but it didn't work like that. The Scots and Irish were far more keen to go to Canada than the English were. The English went where the money was, where the good jobs were, and they went to the States as long as they could get those jobs, and also they thought they had better climate and better land. They were very picky.
My paternal great-great-grandparents moved from Kent and settled in Goderich Township, the Canada Company land, and in the Huron Tract. What I'm wondering, were there economic reasons in the 1835s for a 19 and 21-year-old newly married couple moving to Canada? Do you think it was advertising? It was the lure by the Canada Company, or was there an economic push?
Oh yes. Well, the Canada Company was advertising strenuously to attract the right sort of people, and you could well here have an example of people with skills. The immigration agents in England were all geared up to seek out people in particular areas like Norfolk, Suffolk, and everything where good farming land was available, to seek out people who really knew farming, because the Canada Company was trying to recruit the best they could from England. And you may well find that your ancestor had been actually headhunted, had been recruited, because he had farming skills, because they were desperate to get English farmers out there, because they had, even though the climate was different, and even though they had to be knocked into shape a little bit and told, no, we don't do those things in Canada, thank you very much, we do this way, they came with such a breadth of knowledge of farming and practical skills. They were essentially headhunted in those areas.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could say something about accent. Why is it with all these English immigrants coming to Canada, we no longer speak the same way the English do?
Well, there's a very good reason for that. If I could take you on a magic wand to different parts of England, you'd be amazed at the difference in accent. If you've been to Cornwall, you've been to Somerset, where you've been to Wiltshire, you've been to Yorkshire, my goodness. Sometimes you have to ask them if they could just slow down and repeat what they've said. It is a difficult question to answer, because they came from these separate parts of England with their own accents. And of course, these dialects and accents are going in England now, unfortunately. But at the time, they were very, very strong, and their own vocabulary. I know when I first met Jeff's mother, who's a Yorkshire lady, I had trouble understanding a lot of the words she used. It was a different language. That's all I can say. And it was just the melting pot taking over. The melting pot changed everything. It changed the way one spoke. It changed the value system. It changed everything. The way of life in England was so different from the way of life in Canada. I mean, England was a very constrained society where you doffed your cap to the man in the big house and you only spoke when you were spoken to. You didn't dare offer an opinion. Whereas in Canada, it was a free country where everybody was friendly to you and you could say what you liked and nobody was going to criticize you for that. And so it took the English a while. This is one thing that I noticed that came across in their letters. They loved the idea they were coming to Canada for a better life economically, but they didn't really want to leave their English values behind. And the one thing that I kept on finding were examples of linen tablecloths. Would you believe that in the middle of the prairies, you find these people who'd say, I was horrified, I went to have dinner with somebody, and they had plastic tablecloths. I can't have that. I must have English linen tablecloths. There were these little outbursts of their value system, that the English were great ones for ritual. You showed a visitor you cared, and you were making trouble over them if you produced your linen tablecloth. Canadians didn't do that. There were these little subtle differences that they had to accept and learn that they had come to a different country.
I think we'll do a last one here.
Would it be typical for women to come alone, or was?
Oh yes. I mean, I didn't have time in my lecture, but I have a great deal to say about female domestic servants in my book. It's a subject in its own right. In the days before mechanization, where you had to, get the water from a well, carry it into the house, carry the coal in or the wood in, everything was labor-intensive. Before machines, hard to understand that, but put yourself back in a time where everything had to be done manually. Well, the only way Canada could cope was to get more domestic servants. So there was a huge campaign in conjunction with the Salvation Army, because the Salvation Army acted as the agency here, to get thousands and thousands of English domestic servants to Canada. They were highly approved of, well liked and everything, but yes, it is a big part of the story, and expect some of your ancestors will have come as single women in Salvation Army groups to find employment all over Canada. Particularly large numbers of them went to BC.